Hello again. The WMT Sherman Line is no longer ordinary. Originally a two-track line, it is now 50% quad track. But why? Today we will find out why. But first, a brief introduction to New Appalachia. New Appalachia is a fictional Minecraft city with a twist. The city runs on a timeline-based build system. This means that the builders must rely on the technologies of the current time. If the technology exists, you can build it. The timeline works like this. After 2 real-world days, a month has passed, 24, and you have a year. There is also an economic system. This system is fairly new. However, I will provide a brief explanation on how it works. An inflationary shop exists that users must use to build new transit lines. Every year, the prices inflate. Existing lines will generate revenue based on how much coverage they have within a neighborhood. A recent law change, the city is set in North Carolina and has 3 counties: Westiver, an industrializing transit war zone; Eastand, an underdeveloped land reaching to the Atlantic; and Chatham, a promising land north of both counties. The counties are separated by the Jefferson River, although Eastand connects to Chatham. There are also several private transit companies. First, we have the Westiver-based companies. Westiver Mass Transit Corporation, or the WMT for short, is based out of Smithtown. The WMT currently operates elevated trains as well as subway trains within Westiver, currently the dominant company in Westiver. Next, we have the Hollis Surface Rail Transit Company, or the HST for short, a trolley company which has been plagued with delays and scandals since its founding. However, of recent, certain improvements have occurred. Lastly, but opening its first line before the HST did, we have the New Appalachia Maritime Service, otherwise known as NAMS, a Smithtown-based ferry company which has innovated a new concept called ferry subways, a service which operates ferries via subterranean waterways. There is also an Easton-based transit company, Easton Rapid Transit Corporation, or the ERT for short. The ERT is based in Huxley Heights, a neighborhood across the Jefferson from Hollis. Now that we have a basic understanding of New Appalachia, let us learn about the Sherman. The WMT Sherman Line was opened July 1st, 1901. During the summer of 1901, the Sherman Line was still called the Gordon Line. Some residents even took to calling it the Swamplands Avenue Elevated, as at the time Sherman Avenue was named Swamplands Avenue. However, as a result of confusing directional signage, on September 26, 1904, the Gordon Line was renamed to the Sherman Line. Some residents of Smithtown still call it the Swamplands L. The line was originally opened as a 2-lane elevated service from Smithtown Road to Cowboy Road. All stations except for Smithtown Road only had 2 tracks. Smithtown Road was composed of 3 tracks. However, the center track was not connected to the platform and was only intended to be used as a layup track. It should be noted that the line was built to subway car standards, as a subway line beneath 2nd Avenue proper had always been planned. However, it was not until early 1905 that the line began using heavy rail rolling stock. Throughout the early 1900s, Westiver had fierce competition. Although lines were built to serve the public, the private operators had more hostile ideas in mind. Despite the head of companies hating each other, the WMT operators had never viewed the HST as a critical threat. However, when Intel leaked about a new concept called the Interurban, a service which the WMT viewed as a threat to its bottom line, the company board members immediately began looking for a plan to counter a route that could possibly siphon off all of its suburban ridership. Several proposals had been made throughout 1904, including a complete reconstruction of the Sherman Line, which at the time opened less than 5 years ago. Another radical proposal would look to completely demolish the elevated portions of the Sherman Line and replace them with an underground subway line. One canceled contract from 1905 almost went through with the latter. After intense planning and months of debate, a countermeasure was finally prepared, that being the Hollis Avenue line. Originally called Market Street, the WMT has eyed Hollis Avenue since construction began on its 2nd Avenue line. Several proposals had been made throughout 1905, including a so-called tunnel trap beneath 6th Avenue, the idea of which being to surround a competing company's subway line and obstruct it from extending in either direction. This could be done by constructing a subway line which would use varying depths to navigate under an existing line, and then block it from expanding north or south, east or west beyond the area in which it already exists. New Appalachia had always been extremely hands-off when it comes to what its companies could do. The light-handed approach was something that would have allowed a tunnel trap to occur within the city. However, when several scandals came to light involving the HST, the WMT no longer viewed a tunnel trap as necessary. The company did, however, see the value in building a new 4-track line through downtown Westiver, and a Hollis Avenue line would do just that. Before we proceed, it should be noted that up until 1906, the city would always front the cost of building new subway lines, meaning the companies could afford to blow money on whatever they pleased. However, it was leaked that the WMT was planning a tunnel trap of the HST, something that would have bankrupted the HST and thus wasting thousands in taxpayer dollars. It was decided that, for the foreseeable future, the city would no longer publicly fund the private transit companies. Since the HST was only opened for a short time, it would not be able to cover the costs of expansion anymore. However, an agreement was made between the HST and the city, which would allow it to build a 1906 system using city funds. But the deal was not all roses. Although the city would fund the HST's 1906 expansion, it would be forced to forever lock its fare to 7 cents. Meanwhile, all other Westiver-based companies were operating on 15-cent fares just to make a solid profit. As well as this, should the HST go bankrupt, it would no longer be able to operate as a private entity and would fall into the ownership of the city. NAMS and the WMT would rather retain full ownership than one day fall to inflation, and thus made the decision to cover their operating and construction costs off of revenue. Now that we've covered the funding aspect of this line, let's get back to the line itself. The company had come to several major proposals for a Hollis Avenue line. However, the first one would involve a tunnel trap of the HST 6th Avenue line, as well as much of the line only consisting of 2 tracks. The company instead went with the all Hollis Avenue option. This option would have trains diverge from the Sherman Line near Maple Street in Smithtown and then follow Tidal Avenue northward until reaching Hollis Avenue. The line would then follow Hollis Avenue up to 10th Avenue in Hamilton Heights and terminate at 92nd Street and 10th Avenue. In the final days of August of 1905, Westiver Mass Transit Corporation contracted the rights to build the line. However, a serious problem revealed itself. That being, how Hollis trains should operate once they merged onto the Sherman Line near Maple Street. Transit companies in New Appalachia were allowed to contract lines at will, the only laws at the time being that only one build contract could be signed per year, and that the borders must be well defined. However, as would soon become apparent, elevated lines could simply bypass this law through the company purchasing lots of land and routing the lines via the private plots. Same could not be said for subway lines, as the city had a zero-tolerance policy for overshooting transit borders as defined by a company's annual contract. The initial connection plan would route Hollis Avenue trains via Getty Street and onto the Sherman Avenue line. This, however, would require the use of a tight slip curve. By this point, the WMT viewed the HST threat as a neutralized threat. However, mid-1905, when the company's spies had discovered the early stages of an interurban line right on the doorstep of its new terminal in Madison Heights, it was decided that aggressive action had to be taken to protect ridership at the then under-construction Madison Heights terminal at Shoreline Avenue. Yes, Westiver Mass Transit Corporation had company spies. Something that just goes to show how much power private transit companies had in New Appalachia. Something that the city would repeatedly be criticized for by other cities around the world. However, the city viewed this hands-off approach as an extension of the rights of private businesses. Many people would debate this apparent free reign of transit companies in New Appalachia for years to come. However, throughout the early 1900s, the city would remain firm in its convictions. Back to the Hollis Avenue line. The company had come up with a solution to prevent trains from navigating a tight slip curve. However, it would have to wait until 1906 and spend its contract. Right? Not exactly. The WMT legal department had quickly found a workaround to the zero-tolerance policy. That solution being to purchase plots of land, evicting the tenants, and, in some cases, demolishing several apartments, and then routing the line via plots as well as the Maple Street lots, an area of land parallel to the Smithtown Civil War Cemetery, which was largely undeveloped, aside from a handful of warehouses and several small residential units. Since the company privately owned these plots of land, they technically would not be using any additional public territories, which meant that the elevated line could be built in a way that it would only be supported off of the private plots of land. The first proposal for Sherman Line express tracks had already begun construction, that being stacking an additional pair of elevated tracks above existing ones to the then planned Getty's Slip. However, construction was halted when engineers determined that such tracks would damage the Sherman Avenue line embankment stations over time. This would have resulted from fast-moving express trains destabilizing the stations over time, which would eventually cause both structures to fail. WMT engineers determined that adding express service would require a rebuild of the embankment stations under any scenario. By November of 1905, the decision had been made to partially reconstruct Erie Road, Negan Road, and Cowboy Road as four-lane bypass stations. Polsky Parkway would receive 2 outer tracks and undergo a renovation to accommodate the new service pattern. Trains would then ramp up north of Polsky Parkway and diverge onto the Maple Street flyover, and then dive down into the Tidal Avenue portal, with Sherman trains continuing via the Sherman Line. The stacked trestles of Cowboy Road would be incorporated into the new plans. However, instead of Hollis trains routing through the upper level, they would route via the lower level, with Sherman trains routing through the upper level. The lines would as well swap their intended terminating platforms at Madison Heights Terminal. Despite delays on the 4th Avenue L, the upgrades were rapidly completed and service was restored in due time. It should also be noted that Negan Road was renamed to Avenue D, and Cowboy Road was renamed to Chester Road as a result of a street name change. Since the city was still paying much of the cost in 1905, New Appalachia fronted the brunt of the $2.5 million project. Here we are at Polsky Parkway, heading southbound on the express track. Note the existence now of 2 additional local tracks, part of the recent upgrades. This is a composite car train. The WMT was known for taking no issue with using the same rolling stock as the IRT and BMT in many cases. We pick up speed as we approach Erie Road. This train will top out at around 45 miles per hour. Pay attention here as we pass Erie Road rather quickly. You can see new mosaics, as well as the rebuilt exit to the right, which now exits through a building. As well to the right, we can see the now cut back Gordon Park and the Gordon Lane. The park used to extend as far south as Frontier Road near Avenue M. However, at the time, it was cut back to Avenue C. Here we can see the end of the Gordon Park. We approach Avenue D at high speeds, still retaining our roughly 45 mile per hour speed. There are 2 exits, one to the right, one to the left, both station houses. To the right, we can see the Gordon Yard. At the time, the largest WMT yard was in the process of being nearly tripled in size. At the time, it was referred to as a, quote, gravel field, as we can see. The train begins to lose speed as we approach Chester Road, formerly called Cowboy Road. To the right of us, Jackson Hills. To the left, Gordon Town. We approach Chester Road. Pay attention to the houses. A green one will appear, and to the right of the green house, you may catch a glimpse of the Cowboy Road station house remnants. There they are, to the left of us, directly to the right side of the green house. The train comes to a crawl, and this film concludes.